Okay, welcome everyone to the first London Sport and Mayor of London talking COVID-19 and sport. I'm Kerry Afton, one of the project managers at the Mayor of London's office, and we'll be giving the introduction today. I guess I can kick off with a little bit of an introduction and why we're all here today. So Talking COVID-19 and Sport is a new series of webinars that have been developed in response to the current crisis. And really to address the biggest issues facing London's grassroots sports sector at the moment and to offer some support during the crisis. The initiative is a joint partnership between the community sport team at the Mayor of London's office and London Sport. We're going to be delivering these webinars through Zoom. However, we are aware of some of the accessibility challenges of receiving information in this way. And at the moment, we're looking into ways that we can improve this and provide any of the resources and support and guidance that comes out of these in a different format or follow up with them afterwards. A little bit on the intention of the webinar series, it's really just to provide some practical advice and inspiration to organisations at this time on some of the most pressing challenges like that organisations are facing. Each webinar will be led by a representative from the Mayor of London's community sport team and a representative from London Sport. And for each webinar, we'll also bring in an external industry expert to provide wider insight on the topic. So today, the first of our series, we'll be exploring finance and funding for grassroots sport. We understand that finance, managing money now and in the future is probably one of the biggest challenges and one of the most concerning things for organisations, but also people at an individual and personal level. And over the last few weeks, there have been a lot of financial initiatives and support packages launched from a variety of sources, whether that's central government or civil society sector. And we've been hearing that people are feeling extremely overwhelmed by the level and complexity of some of that information. So the purpose of the webinar today is to provide you with a little bit of a summary of the financial support that's available to help you digest everything on offer, signpost you to relevant things that might help, and also answer any queries or concerns that you might have immediately. Chris, if you just want to go to the next slide. So I'm introduced by our two speakers. The first will be Chris Scott, who many of you will know, Head of Communications at London Sport. I'm really extremely fortunate today to be joined by Georgie Frost. She's our industry expert this week, and she's a financial journalist and award-winning TV and radio broadcaster. Georgie is currently a money mentor at The Times and was named Personal Finance Journalist of the Year. But not only is Georgie an expert in finance, she's also a sports coach herself and a qualified referee, so is well placed to be speaking on this topic today. In terms of the running order, next slide, Chris. The first 10 to 15 minutes, Chris will outline what support is available to the community sports sector. We'll then hear a few comments from Georgie before using the rest and majority of the time to take questions and queries from you. We do have a chat available, so as we're going through the presentation, if everyone can submit their questions or comments or thoughts in the chat box, we'll pick those up after the presentation, and I can pose these questions to the speakers for you. And come back with answers. I think it's just worth pointing out that the advice and answers that we're meant to be giving are obviously quite general advice. None of us are qualified financial advisors, so it's meant to be like generic advice rather than specific kind of personal advice. So I think that's everything from me. Chris, I'll hand over to you to kind of pick up on the presentation.
Thanks, Kerry, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. If anyone can't hear me, if my audio is not coming through, I hope somebody might flag it on the chat function, but I'll assume I'm heard. So as Kerry said, from a London sport perspective, we're really delighted to be able to be part of this and sort of trying to do what we can to, I guess, help the sector along at what is obviously an incredibly challenging time for everybody. The next 10 minutes, I'm just going to kind of spend focusing on a little bit of headline information about the different forms of financial support that we are aware of as being available to the community sports sector. Some of this will be very particular to community sport representatives. Other components are going to be more general and sort of broadly available to different facets of society. Hopefully this just helps to provide a little bit of a sort of map, I guess, for people to understand what is available and what our understanding of some of the conditions around some of those finance opportunities are. So I'm going to begin to talk about probably the bit that's most specific to our sector and our stakeholders, and probably, I would guess, most people that are on this call in a professional capacity, which is the dedicated sport funding that has been made available. The sort of main source of this really is from Sport England, and they have made available around about £200 million worth of investments specifically to support the community sports sector and physical activity sector through the current COVID-19 crisis. There are essentially three tranches of partner support funding that have been made available, and one emergency fund. The partner support funding that exists is a sector partner fund, which Sport England is using to provide financial support to organisations that they currently fund that are existing partners that are experiencing very acute or particular financial challenges based on the current situation. A second fund that exists in that field is the Sector Stimulation Fund, which is a pot of money which hasn't yet begun to be attributed, but is going to be used slightly further down the line as a stronger indication of what a return to normal is going to look like, to help invest in things which will actually either supercharge good ideas where they're found and help to bring and position new innovation in a way that supports the ambitions of the sector, or that helps to get things moving again once a beginning of a return to normality is underway. And the third part of the partner support, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, is an existing funding rollover. Anyone that is able to access that funding rollover will have been or will be contacted by Sport England about it. Essentially, it's to reduce the administrative burden on existing funded partners and enable continued confidence among those that receive core funding from Sport England. The one that I will spend a bit more time on is the Community Emergency Fund, which Sport England announced and launched over the past couple of weeks. Now, the Community Emergency Fund is a sort of open emergency grant funding pod, which has been built based on Sport England's experiences of providing emergency funding after the flooding crisis, which particularly impacted the north and the west of the country at the beginning of 2020. This Community Emergency Fund, the COVID-19 Community Emergency Fund, is open to all organisations working in and around physical activity and sport, including those not currently funded by Sport England. And it's providing grants that are between £300,000 and £10,000 to organisations that are helping the nation to be active, but are experiencing some form of short-term financial hardship or are unable to continue their activities because of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. One of the sort of key things in here is this fund is really aiming for swift responses and to get money out as quickly as possible to the organisations that need it at this time. The first grants were actually awarded after 48 hours after the fund was released. So Sport England are really moving at a very swift rate, or as swiftly as they're able to, under the volume of applications that they're receiving. And it is probably the only specific fund that I'm aware of that is focusing explicitly on physical activity and sport and on our sector as a whole. So in a lot of ways, where the conditions are correct for it, this is actually a really good first port of call fund, although it is also intended to be a last port of call for organisations that are unable to access funding from some of the government sources, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. One of the really positive things about this fund in particular for our sector, in my view, is the assessment and scoring of it is really by people that are specialists in the physical activity and sports space. And as such, there's a kind of really inherent understanding of the importance and the value of physical activity and sport from the people that are assessing and overseeing the funding applications that come in. It's therefore a really kind of useful and positive response from within the sports sector, and one that I imagine most people are already familiar with. But if anyone's not familiar with it, it really is worth looking at, and it's certainly a kind of excellent resource for the sector. The other aspect of sport funding that we are already aware of that does exist and is out there in the world at the moment is some aspects of national governing body funding. Some of the major NGBs have made sport-specific funding available. So the ECB for cricket, the LTA for tennis, and the RFU for rugby union have all produced their own kind of emergency funding pots for their particular sport. If you're representing an NGB-affiliated body at this stage, it is probably worth checking with your NGB, either digitally via their website, or if you have a relationship manager at that NGB, just to see whether they have any information on support that might be available. Obviously, there are going to be much stronger restrictions around this in terms of who's available to, who's able to apply for it. But if you are in one of the sports that is providing financial support, the NGB is undoubtedly a really good place to begin with. And I strongly suspect there are other NGBs that have done this or have this in track. It just happens these are the three that I'm aware of or was aware of as I was putting together this presentation. The next area of funding to focus on quickly is mayoral funding or London-specific funding. The most kind of prominent of these funds is the London Community Response Fund, which was launched really swiftly following the introduction of lockdown procedures. And coordinated by London funders, it essentially provides coordinated support to agencies and bodies working in London to help respond to the needs of communities that have been impacted by COVID-19. It's come hand in hand with some really strong measures from London funders around coordinating funding efforts to make sure A, that money is getting to the right places as quickly as possible, but B, and in some ways more importantly, that there's real flexibility in the behaviour of funders towards their funded bodies, so that there's not so much of an administrative burden around the continuation of funding to agencies doing really important work at this stage in London. The Community Response Fund, the London Community Response Fund, is in its second phase now. So there was a first phase of grants that were distributed to really address kind of acute response issues. And there's now a second area, which is looking at larger grants that are focused on 10 key themes. And these key themes have kind of been identified by a coalition of different funders that are working to coordinate the London Community Response Fund. They are very, very wide-ranging, and it's not obviously immediately apparent that they all have a connection to physical activity and sport. There's certainly not a dedicated physical activity and sport theme within the London Community Response Fund. But in discussions that I've had over the past week or so, there's certainly a number of themes within that fund that I think are really relevant to a lot of agencies that are working in physical activity and sport. The ones that you should be able to see highlighted on your screen at the moment, so children, young people, domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, equity and inclusion, homelessness, people at risk, and refugees and migrants are all areas that I'm personally aware of sport organisations that are operating in that space at the moment. And I suspect a great number of community sport organisations have a distinct or associative connection with those themes. So although it may not seem on the face of it that the London Community Response Fund has a direct pot for physical activity and sport, if your organisation is working in one of those spaces, it's absolutely worth looking at this particular fund, especially because this one is dedicated to London and therefore really relevant to any groups that are predominantly or solely delivering in a London environment. It's also worth saying that as a group, the funders involved in this do seem to be really open to influence about areas that might have been missed in the shaping of this fund as well. So if you really strongly feel, and if you're part perhaps of a group of organisations that feels there's something really missing from within this, that information is worth collecting. I know certainly at the Mayor's office, there are people there that would be interested in hearing about things that might be missing from this. Similarly, London funders have always been a very open organisation and very interested in maintaining dialogue. So it is also worth identifying if you feel that there are areas that are missing from the London Community Response Fund. Moving on, civil society funding is something I'm going to touch on, but I've had to change this, this information in the last few days based on some changes to the fund I'm going to mention. So the Charities Aid Foundation Coronavirus Emergency Fund, that some of you may already be aware of, is a rapid response emergency fund that was launched to help smaller charitable organisations that have been impacted by COVID-19. And it's a really flexible and open fund, but such has been the kind of volume of interest in this fund that they've had to actually pause applications for the moment to allow their grant management teams to assess the volumes that have come in so far. The current statement from Charities Aid Foundation is that they do hope to reopen it to new applicants. So it's certainly still worth checking out if you haven't made an application so far. But what they've also done, which I think is additionally really valuable, is they've consolidated a wide range of available civil society funds that are still open for application. The website houses a live list of those, and it's actually a really useful resource in identifying where there may be other funding routes that you could pursue in the time where the Charities Aid Foundation's own fund is under pause. The other aspect that I'm going to sort of talk to a little bit, but suddenly Georgie, who will be speaking with us in the Q&A later, is much more expert in a lot of these areas than I am, is the government financial assistance packages that have been made available. I'm going to specifically talk about 6. This is not necessarily exhaustive, but these appear to be the ones that are likely to be most relevant to most people working in this space. So as pretty much everyone I imagine will know, as the lockdown procedures were developed and the economic impact of COVID-19 became more apparent, government announced a range of different financial assistance packages for businesses and for individuals that are designed to effectively offer sustainability and continuity during this time. I'm going to go through each of the 6 that are listed on the right-hand side in a moment. The first to talk about is the business rates relief and the cash grants initiative that was put in place. So this was essentially designed to provide structural relief essentially to businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19. And our understanding based on the kind of advice within this measure is that sports grounds and clubs, sport and leisure facilities and gyms are all eligible for the 100% business rate relief for the 2021 period. Alongside that, there are grants available between £10,000 and £25,000, so the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant, and other small business grant funds that are available. These obviously are being determined in different ways, but the advice that we, as we understand it, and certainly based on recommendations published by the Sport and Recreation Alliance, suggests that community amateur sports clubs and charities are both believed to be eligible. But the guidance is quite clear that it's really up to local authorities to administer local schemes and to determine where their sort of local grant relief should be issued. So the guidance on this is quite lengthy, but is certainly worth looking into. Equally, where you have a relationship with the local authority, this may be one area to discuss with them if there is an open line of communication there. The coronavirus business interruption loan scheme may be less relevant to the majority of people on this group, so I'm going to go over this one very, very quickly. But this is essentially a loan system that's been put in place to allow smaller businesses to access cash as it's needed at the time where there may be cash flow issues or crises based on a lack of incoming funds. It's being delivered through the British Business Bank and by a range of lenders. There's around about 40 lenders that are connected to the programme. And it's available to organisations with a turnover less than £45 million. But it has to be organisations that have and are able to self-certify that they've been adversely impacted by COVID-19. Now, the reason this perhaps isn't so relevant to a number of people working in our sector is that grant-funded further education establishments, public sector bodies and state-funded primary and secondary schools are all ineligible for this financial assistance. But other businesses working in the sport and physical activity space will be as eligible as any other business. I think one of the key things here is that the borrowing proposal that's submitted has to be considered viable, and it would have to be considered viable were it not for the current impact of COVID-19. So this is definitely a loan in its most technical sense. The National Lottery Community Fund is a slightly different form of financial assistance, and it goes alongside around about £360 million of direct funding allocation that government departments are making specifically to charities and groups of charities, predominantly those that are addressing and contributing to the alleviation of the COVID-19 crisis. The National Lottery Community Fund is £370 million worth of funding that's being aimed at smaller and medium-sized charities that are working in local communities. But the understanding as it stands is it's likely to mainly focus on direct support and alleviation. Those may be things like the delivery of food, the provision of essential medicines, or guidance provided to communities, particularly financial advice and guidance. But the funding criteria for this hasn't yet been set. The last update from last week said that the National Lottery Community Fund were looking to publish that guidance as soon as they were able to, following discussions with government. So that's one to keep a watching eye on. It would seem likely that the sort of guidance will fall into place in the next week or 2 weeks, but things are moving quickly. Business tenancy and facilities rents is another area that government have outlined clear assistance on. And the passage of the Coronavirus Act provides some very distinct protections for businesses, suddenly up until 30th of June this year, and that date may well be extended based on recommendations more widely from government around the coronavirus response. Business tenants should be and are protected from forfeiture for non-payment of rent. But the obligation to pay rent isn't waived, just deferred until the end of the period, and it will be liable for recovery after that point. Just one flag that that I'm aware of that I think is worth raising around this is that some news that came out over the weekend and some advocacy by UK Active, the leisure industries trade association, was reporting that a number of commercial gyms seemed to be falling victim or potential victim to loophole legal action from landlords, despite the provisions of the Act, so pursuing other means that were putting those businesses at risk of distress. UK Active have been doing an awful lot of work, both to government and in the public eye around this space, and they're probably leading in terms of the potential impact this has on the commercial fitness industry. And again, it might be worth kind of keeping an eye on what they're publishing around this, because I think some of the advice coming out of UK Active in this space at the moment is kind of sector leading, as I would perceive it. The coronavirus jobs retention scheme is probably one of the measures that most people are in some way familiar with, and this is essentially about the furloughing of workers and the provision of money to pay workers' costs up to 80% of their salary, or up to £2,500 per month. Governments are also covering, as part of this furloughing scheme, employer national insurance and pension contributions on top of the 80% wage contribution that government's available to make. I think the most important thing to highlight here, and this is particularly pertinent to a lot of sport organisations, is that an organisation that's receiving continuing public funding for staff costs and core costs, and that does include Sport England funding, should be continuing to pay staff, and it shouldn't be making use of the furlough under those circumstances. Where organisations are able to and have chosen to furlough workers, those workers are able to undertake training and voluntary work, but they can't provide services or generate revenue for their employers at this time. The last part of government financial assistance, just to raise here, is the self-employment income support scheme. So this is the piece that kind of looks at the self-employment aspect. This is designed to kind of essentially meet the same criteria as the furloughed workers scheme. So again, taxable grants to self-employed people worth up to 80% of average profits over the past 3 years of self-employment, up to £2,500 a month. There are a range of eligibility criteria associated with this. Average profits of £50,000 or less are a requirement. A completed and submitted tax return for 2019 is a requirement, as are a number of other things. But there are other measures that are available as part of this to self-employed people, including eligibility for universal credit at a rate equivalent to statutory sick pay for employees. Again, I know we've had a couple of pre-submitted questions around this, and I think that's something that we'll touch on a little bit in the Q&A in a moment. So I'll move on from this one at this point. The last little bits I wanted to flag for a couple of general pointers are some of the support and resources that at London Sport we're aware are available to people in our sector at this stage. There are certainly a number of sector organisations that are providing really robust and useful advice and guidance, both to their members, but also upwards to funders, to government, and to kind of various decision makers, both nationally and locally. Certainly personally, I'm aware that London Youth Sport and the Street Games have all done really excellent and really forward-thinking work in this space. And if you are associated with any of those bodies, or indeed any other bodies that have a kind of broader responsibility for physical activity and sport, it's really worth talking to them about actually what advice they may be able to provide, or what messages they can convey to other decision makers on the behalf of other organisations. That sort of collective voice has definitely been really powerful so far in helping to kind of achieve some of the successes that have been seen. And those three organisations and many more are doing really excellent work in this space. Sport England have also published some really useful funding guidance. And actually, if you look at their website in the areas that are about the emergency fund, they've got some really explicit and kind of dedicated information about what makes a worthwhile funding application in that space. It's really worth having a look at that because it is really clear, it's very simple, and I think it's actually a really helpful resource, not just for Sport England's fund, but for other fundings available in this space at the moment. The other thing that I'm just going to use this opportunity to raise is a service that London Sport is able to offer to people working community sport for free. We essentially operate a free check and challenge service for community sport groups that are applying for sport sector funding. We do that generally, but obviously at the moment, a lot of our efforts are focused on requests and inquiries we get in that are to do with COVID-19 response funding. If anyone is interested in taking up that service, if you contact funding@londonsport and info@londonsport.org, so those two email addresses, For further details, someone in our team will be able to come back to you with a bit of information about the support we're able to provide. Equally, if you have a pre-written funding application that you wanted to get our eyes on, you can also send that over to those two addresses, and we will respond to it as quickly as we're able to do. The last thing that I'm just going to mention before I kind of hand back to Kerry to lead us into the Q&A is just kind of a few bits of advice that I've garnered from various people as I've gone through preparing some of the slides for today. I think the first thing just to kind of make clear is that there's a really widespread recognition that this current period is genuinely unprecedented, and we talk about that in very open terms. But the pressure that's creating is also pressure that's being felt by some of the funders that are trying to support and provide assistance at this stage. I think everyone's doing what they can to adapt to what are very, very challenging situations, but it can cause, and it has on occasion caused, a bit of a lag in response. I think where understanding can be shown, that's going down very, very well, but it's not to say that people aren't aware that there's a kind of widespread challenge that people are facing, and it goes without saying that people recognise that one of the major stresses is funding, financing and economic support at this stage. So people's concerns are, as I understand it, definitely being heard. It's my sense that the sports sector focused funding that's available kind of offers the greatest proportional likelihood of success for people that are applying for funding, but there is a lot more funding available generally within the civil society world. So I think it's for anyone looking at bidding for funding, it's worth looking across all aspects and not limiting yourselves to just the sport funds that are available. Whatever you're doing around funding application, it's absolutely worth having a look and dedicating time to some due diligence on it. So before you submit applications, just making sure that you are eligible for the funding that's available before you invest time in writing the application. There's nothing worse than time spent writing an application to find out that actually you don't meet the criteria hurdle. And most criteria are very explicit and made very clear. So it's definitely worth just making sure of that before you enter into a process. And if you've got any trade or association membership, so you might be a member of UK Active, you might be a member of the Sport and Recreation Alliance, for example, or some of those other organisations I've mentioned earlier on in today's session, it's definitely worth speaking to that trade body. A lot of them are doing really collective advocacy, which can be really, really powerful, but a lot of them have also produced some really excellent up-to-date guidance on the support and the financing that is available. Those people are there and standing very, very willing and ready to help. So it's definitely worth pursuing that avenue if it's one that's available to you. And the final thing is probably just to say, it's worth not being put off by your existing funding knowledge. You may feel that you don't have a lot of knowledge of navigating funding landscapes, but there is a really widespread understanding that this period has put people under an incredible amount of pressure, and that there needs to be a lot more flexibility than there might normally be from funders to help meet the pressing concerns of individuals and of groups. So organisations are being as understanding as they can. It's definitely worth pursuing things, even if you perhaps feel that you don't have the expertise there. And where you need a bit of guidance, do reach out to some of those organisations that are willing to help. I would absolutely include London Sport in that. One of the roles that we see for ourselves in this period is to help community sport organisations to navigate what's out there. So use the support that's available and do go for things that is absolutely worthwhile. I think I'll leave that at that point and hand back to Kerry.
Thanks, Chris. Just before I hand over to Georgie, I think I could see people are putting some questions in the public chat and some people are messaging some questions privately. So either or, if you have comments or questions on any of these and you want to put them in the chat to everybody, or if you want to just send them privately, then just please feel free now. I don't know, Georgie, whether you had any just kind of comments or remarks on that, or whether you want to go straight into the Q&A.
Yeah, I hope everyone can hear me all right. I just have a couple of things that I would like to say before we get started. As a finance journalist, but also, as you mentioned, Kerry, I'm a qualified football coach, referee. I've been involved in sport as a journalist, a player and a fan. And while, of course, we'll be talking about businesses and the help that's available there, I just want to say that grassroots sports is ultimately about individuals. It's about the workers, the volunteers, the participants. There are very, very few of us who aren't personally worried about our futures at the moment. And that in and of itself is going to have an impact on sport going forward. And I want to say that for the clubs, but also for those people who make our clubs, there is help out there. That's what I'm going to be focusing on today. It's the government support. But we've heard these words today, the two watchwords are going to be flexibility and patience. Now, a lot of government support services, banks, mortgage lenders, utility firms, all those people that can help you during this time will be absolutely clogged up. They just simply are not designed to take on this number of people who are trying to access them. Some of the schemes, and this might be frustrating for you to hear, are so new, they aren't even up and running yet. You will have read, doubtless, some of the bad news stories about how few businesses have been able to take up things like the business interruption loan scheme, for example. But I would urge you, please, or with universal credits or anything like that, don't give up. And finally, this is a difficult time, and your health and your safety is absolutely paramount. Many of you will be worried about your clubs, your jobs. Some of you will be furloughed, or you've lost your jobs altogether. But this absolutely can be a time for planning, for creativity, and even for growth, and perhaps in areas that you never imagined. We're already, I don't know if you've done any of these, but we're already seeing a number of workout from home classes that are being offered. Just one story, I had one guy contact me on Twitter, really worried. He ran a football coaching business. As you can imagine, he's not doing a lot at the moment. I answered his money issues that he had about self-employment and what he could get. I should point out, as Kerry did, I'm not an accountant and I'm not qualified to give financial advice. But I also suggested that, given one of the things that I struggled to find when I first became a football coach was just a decent, straightforward manual, that perhaps he should think about doing one. And he messaged me the other day and he said he's already started on it and he'll send me a copy in the post when it's done. This will be over, and we will need grassroots sports and all that it offers us as individuals and our communities more than ever. While right now it is enough just to survive, we also want to thrive as well. So just a couple of reminders as well before I leave. Government support is changing all the time as we're adapting to this. It's changing daily. So go onto the government website to get the absolute latest. There is so much information on there. Also, here is a really key one at the best of times, but now it's really specific. Fraudsters are abound. So please be extra vigilant, especially with emails purporting to be from HMRC. If they offer financial help, a tax refund, if they ask you to click a link or give any personal information, it is a scam. And finally, if you do have any individual questions related to your own personal circumstances that you don't want to bring up here, or that perhaps you want to go into in more detail afterwards, please do feel free to email me or the team of journalists that I work for at the Times. Just go to timesmoneymentor.co.uk and we will do our very best, as we're doing at the moment, to give you an answer or to find it out for you.
Thanks very much. That's really kind of you as well to offer that kind of personal support as well. Chris, I'll just start off. The question came in about just to kind of follow up on the Sport England slide. And do you know how regularly they'll be publishing, and if they will be publishing data on the grants that are awarded under that fund?
That's a good question. Actually, just before I answer that, one thing I'm going to say is on the call as well as another of my colleagues at London Sport, Mel, who is our funding specialist. So where there are things I might not be able to respond to, I may just call on Mel to provide a little bit more specialist expertise on that. And Mel's just turned her camera on so you can see her there. My understanding is that there are plans to try and do that, and we're exploring it in conversations with them at the moment, but I don't have a definitive answer. And I've not yet seen anything in terms of a commitment towards that. But generally, my understanding is they are attempting to be as transparent as they can through all of this. And I suspect that is the kind of rationale they're taking forwards on. Mel, I don't know if you've got anything that supplements that at all in terms of conversations you've had with them.
They are meant to be updating all their grant data on 360 Giving. But at the moment, the data that's on there is only till 2017. So the view is that it will go on there. They're going through that process at the moment. But I suspect, like you, they'll advertise as they do normally with like a list and announce those in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, I had a quick look actually on the grant now. Just on the London Community Response Fund, they will be publishing as they go along all of the grants that they're rewarding under that fund. And just while I kind of talk to that, just in response to your presentation as well, Chris, about the National Lottery Community Funds, they are one of the larger funders of that fund. So I don't know, but it could be quite likely that they will pour quite a lot of their money into that fund, because the intention of it is to make it easy and accessible and one route of access for funding for organisations in London. So it could be that they pull quite a lot of their central government funding into that, but we'll have to wait and see on that one as well.
And just to add what you said, Kerry, London Community Foundation, one of the distributors of the National Emergency Trust money, but that money will also be pulled into the London Community Response Fund as well.
Okay, perfect. We've had a question come in, a common situation I'm sure for others. So how can grassroots organisations who subcontract freelancers rather than employing staff through the PAYE system access funding to continue delivering much needed work and pay their workers? So Chris, I don't know if you had could kind of clarify which of the ones would be appropriate for that.
I'm going to be really honest, that's one that is beyond my my capability. I may have to pass the buck on that one, I'm afraid.
No worries, Georgie.
So the question is, how can we continue to employ subcontractors, basically?
Yeah.
So this to me just sounds a business interruption loan type scheme of getting loans, because of course, please do continue, if you can, to employ those people that you did before. The loan schemes that are available, which Chris outlined, and there's a lot more detail in them, are there to help, you know, good businesses, but continue that otherwise would be struggling during this time, continue to pay staff with any cash flow issues you might have. So I would look into going to those. They are dependent on the size. I think most of the people who will be listening will probably fall into the sort of small to medium size, but there is a larger business interruption loan scheme that's not up and running at the moment. But the smaller one is the one that you will probably be reading about in the newspapers at the moment. There is a backlog, there's a bit of a clog up because it's run through the British Business Bank website that at the moment just simply wasn't designed to offer this in this amount. So, but please do go on. There are 40 accredited lenders on this scheme as it stands at the moment. They're looking into increasing that at the moment. Not everyone will be accepted, only those that can prove they are viable and have been trading successfully before coronavirus hit. So you just need short-term support now to, as you said, continue paying for subcontractors to keep your business going. So that is one of the options available there. I guess it's those sorts of government funding schemes that you can access as well. I would also say check what you are eligible for anyway, because clearly so many people in this, if not everybody in this sector, will be very affected by this. I don't know the size of your business or how it's run or the premises or anything like that, but there are things like small business grant schemes. So, you know, any with a rateable value of 15,000 or under, particularly, as I said, for smaller businesses as well. Look into what options are available to you, but many of those are these will be run by the council. They should get in contact with you if you are eligible, but I will just mention with the small business grant scheme that some councils are doing it differently. So it may be that you have to get in contact with them and go through an application process as well. But there is so much information on this, and there's so much help available.
So much. I think if it's to deliver things like additional services in response to this crisis, and they are across those groups that Chris outlined in terms of the grant funding for London, then again, that's something that those grants will cover the cost for in order to respond to the crisis. We had a question around how can community sport and physical activity organisations access funding for core costs in the current climate? And do any of the ones that you outlined cover core cost funding?
You want me to say that, Kerry?
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah, my understanding is a number of them are open to funding core costs. And I suppose in some ways it depends whether you have an existing core cost funding relationship or not. So if, for example, Sport England is funding core costs, the likelihood is that you would fall into one of the other non-emergency support packages that Sport England has made available at the moment. If you don't, it is a slightly trickier area, but again, the Sport England Community Response Fund will cover a range of different, there's not actually that many restrictions around what they'll allow you to cover, so long as you are meeting the general guidelines and outlines of what the fund is designed to respond to. And similarly, some of the other kind of not-for-profit and third sector funds that are there are also quite open to funding the ongoing operations of an organisation, whether that's core cost or operational cost. I think, yeah, there's not that many actually I've noticed that aren't open or explicitly not open to funding core costs, but each fund of course does have its own guidelines, its own restrictions, and that's why it really is worth just digging into some of the kind of funding guidelines that are available there, because some of them are very, very explicit about what they can and what they cannot cover.
Thanks. We've had a couple of questions around kind of public funding. Someone's asked, is there an exact definition of public funding, followed by a couple of questions around an organisation that receives it. So we receive a small amount of funding from Lewisham Council, about 10% of their total income. So can the staff not covered by the council funding be eligible for furlough? And another kind of related kind of question. So if staff are funded through public funds, including Sport England, but are more urgently required to provide an emergency response on the front line, can staff be transferred into this work without suffering a penalty from the funder? So the kind of slightly related questions. George, I don't know if you know any more on this in terms of kind of the definitions around that and restrictions of use of kind of public funds already.
So my understanding, and this might be more crisp, but my understanding is I can't see why not. If those staff would have been made redundant as a result of coronavirus, this scheme is here to stop that happening. So I don't know if you want me to go into more detail about what is involved in terms of furloughing, but the idea is quite simply so that we do keep hold of staff members that would otherwise be made redundant. The government will back up 80%. It's up to you if you want to cover 20%, but where that public funding that you got, about 10% you said of your total income, doesn't, I assume, all go on staff. I mean, the public funding you'll get will also be to cover any other issues you have. What the government job retention scheme is to do is purely for those staff. I mean, there are caveats to it. You know, it's up to £2,500 per staff member, 80%, as I said, 3 months at least. Again, another thing that you might be hearing at the moment is the government are likely to change this. Now, they said that it would be brought in from the 1st of March, so we can backdate it. But there is, of course, an issue with redundancy. You have to give 45 days notice. If that is to be the case, that happens this weekend. So we are likely to get in the next few days an update from the government, with any luck, saying that they will continue this scheme. Otherwise, companies have to start telling staff that they can't go. That's just a little extra thing to note, that the government will likely extend this scheme. But furloughing is a technical term. You have to officially discuss with the employee. You have to go through the proper channels. You have to let HMRC know what you're doing, and then you can go through that process. So do follow those guidelines. And the reminder about redundancy and furloughing is those rights that we had as employees. I've sort of gone off topic here, but it's still relevant to know our employment rights that we had before are still here now. So don't think that this is an uncharted territory. However, our employment rights are still in place.
Perfect, thanks. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Chris.
Nothing to add, just to concur completely. I think it's really only organisations in the situation where 100% of their core costs and their staff wages are paid by public funding that restriction on not being able to access the furloughing scheme would come into place. I would include my own employer in that respect, because we are covered by public funding. We are not eligible to be furloughed, and it's not something we would pursue. And I think that's the sort of general expectation and understanding on which government has made that scheme available. As Georgie said, all of this is about protecting people's jobs at the end of the day.
Yeah. We've had a couple of questions come in around self-employed people, which I think is probably worth clarifying. So one of the questions, for example, so we have some self-employed instructors working for us. Do we assume they're eligible for the self-employed grant, or should we be having a discussion with them to ask if they're eligible? Somebody else followed up in a similar situation. They're self-employed athletics coach, and that's their main source of income. So like, could we kind of go through, I guess, explaining what the process is, I guess, for self-employed people, and if and what people need to do about it to access funding?
Yeah, okay, certainly. I mean, the first one about we have some self-employed instructors working for us, so we assume they're eligible, or should we be having the discussion with them? I welcome all chats with those people that you employ, and I don't mean this in a disrespecting way, but it's not really your concern, it's theirs, basically. It's up to the self-employed person. They should be made aware of what they're entitled to. Now, in terms of, and I assume they are not working at the moment, they're unable to work because, you know, let's assume the gym structures, you've had to close your gym, for example, so they're not working. So they would be, one would imagine, in line to get the self-employment income support scheme. I say they should be because there are caveats to that scheme. But just to give you an idea, this was something that was announced by the Chancellor that was quite a similar measure to the job retention schemes that I just mentioned there for employees, but to help self-employed people. So it would be those who obviously can't work at the moment from coronavirus or anything related to it, and they would get a certain amount of money backdated up to £2,500 a month. It's a taxable grant of 80% of their average profits over the previous 3 years. Again, caveats. I'm afraid anybody who became self-employed after April 2019, you are not covered. Company directors, you are not covered, though you can furlough yourself. Let's not go down that dark avenue right now. So these are the options that are available. As to how much you'll get, now that relates to, assume you fill out your self-assessment, your staff will fill out their self-assessment, or your self-employed workers will. And on that, you'll have a trading profit, and it's that they work out minus your expenses. That is likely to be what you'll get. And they say averaged out over 3 years, just because that's fair. Say you had a really great 2 years ago and a really rubbish one last year. They even that out so that it will be over 3 years. However, if you haven't done it over 3 years, they'll just go consecutive 2 years or 1 year. And that's how much money you're likely to get, so long as you earn under £50,000. And self-employment wage is your predominant income. So it's over 50% of your money comes from your self-employment. Now, as to whether you can apply, you don't. Not yet. And this is where I'm going to annoy a lot of people, saying this scheme is one of the schemes that is slowest to get going. So they're still working through a lot of the details. Anyone who says they're an expert in this is not, because I've spoken to HMRC quite a lot on this, and there is nobody. The scheme is still being designed. This is one of those things that is absolutely being designed specifically for this situation. As and when it comes, because I know this is so frustrating because the money is unlikely to come in June, until the start of June. We have no date on this. As and when it comes up, you are likely to hear from HMRC around about the end of May. We think via email, which is why I mentioned at the start about being careful about scammers. So God, for goodness sakes, please do. But we think it will be via email. If you are eligible, you have to show that you've been impacted by coronavirus. So it's only for those people who have. You will then be invited to apply for it. The money will come in and it will be backdated 3 months. So in answer to your question, yes, you as the company, let's say the gym, who employs self-employed instructors, it's not really your concern, it's really theirs. It's how they structure their business, how much they've been paid, and it's between them and their HMRC accountant gods, basically. And we will find out at the end of May, start of June. Hopefully money will start coming in for those people. There is help out there for anyone who is waiting for that scheme, and I urge you, please, to look into things like universal credit. Again, another one of those stories where you will have heard that over 1 million people have applied for it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't. Please do. There are other things, job seekers allowance. You can also defer your income tax and your VAT payments as well. Look into things like child benefits, council tax reductions, and if anybody is really struggling, then please do contact, turn to us, Step Change, Citizens Advice. There's a lot of free charitable debt advice out there that I do implore you to go to.
Perfect, thanks. We're kind of coming into the last bit of this. We've had a question come in around they basically had to stop their delivery since the middle of March. They're funded by Mayor of London, amongst other funders. And will they still be recognised and be able to open, as we as funders open to kind of supporting them through these difficult times? I mean, I can speak on behalf of the Mayor of London. You'll have seen that we signed up to the London Funders Statement, which I think now has nearly 300 funders from across the whole of the UK, not just London, who have signed up to that, about being flexible funders. I know London Sport exactly the same. And I think it's just, as much as possible in this time, just have an open conversation with people that fund you and have funded you over the past about your current situation and things going forward. I think more than ever, funders are more than willing to be open and communicate with you. So I think it's just kind of getting in touch, and most funders will be willing to kind of have a conversation with you about what can be done going forward. And I know it's something that we anyway are looking at. I know there'll be concerns around, if all the money's been pulled into responding to this crisis, what about future grants and programmes and stuff like that? And that's something that we're definitely considering as a team at the Mayor of London, about what those future programmes look at in terms of grants and programmes that community sport organisations would have been thinking and working towards applying. So it's a matter of watch this space and also just make sure that you're having open conversations, I think, with funders as well. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, really, Chris, around future funding.
I think the point you've made there, I mean, all of the points you made are absolutely the right ones, and I think it is. Firstly, I think it's really important that we do hear about these challenges, whether as funders or frankly as kind of representatives of the wider sports sector, because that sort of sense of dialogue and receiving information from people that really are at the coalface of this is critical to our ability to change our own behaviours if we need to, or to influence others that might be in a position to actually enhance or advance the support that's there. I think the best piece of advice that I've seen is really one of the ones that Kerry made there, which is that this is the time to be in really open dialogue with your funders. I think every funder that I've seen that's working out there at the moment and is really looking to address the challenges that smaller organisations are facing, that the biggest thing they're all saying is talk to us about it, help us to understand the particular challenges you're facing. This is where some of the grant funding stuff, in my view, differs from some of the kind of structural finance support. Structural finance support is there as a kind of systemic intervention. The grant funding side of things is there absolutely as a means to help continue relationships which have been built up over many years based on the value of work that people are actually contributing out into communities. And the power of this in some ways is those two things working together, the really strong structural support. And I actually think, despite the challenges that have been there, some of the steps that the government have taken are actually really welcome and have actually been very bold and ambitious, and perhaps unexpectedly so. But I think equally the grant funding community is taking really, really strong responsibility for its own actions at this stage, but it's only able to act in as effective way as it can because it receives feedback from people that are experiencing these conditions on the ground. In a lot of ways, I know the Mayor's office are incredibly forthright about being front foot and being activist in this space, and that's to be really welcomed. And I think I've seen that from a lot of other funders, and I would include Sport England in that as well.
Perfect, thanks. I mean, I think we've only got 5 minutes left, so I think we kind of need to kind of wrap up a little bit now. We kind of have a few more questions, but I do just want to flag before people start dropping off the call that we've got a social media poll. I know that my colleague Solomon's posted the link in the chat, so if people wouldn't mind before they drop off kind of clicking on the link and providing us with a little bit of feedback on the webinars. I'll take one more question, and then Chris, I'll let you wrap up about kind of the future series and one. So we've had one come in about, are small limited businesses eligible for Sport England's community fund? Is that yes?
Short answer is yes. My understanding is that it's not purely limited to not-for-profits. It is limited to organisations that are working in the community sport space. So there are going to be some definitions within that around what type of activity you can be doing, and also kind of what your business structure actually is. But it's not wholly limited. There's certainly no guidance I've seen that says it's explicitly limited to not-for-profits. Mel, I don't know if you're aware of any specific definitions that Sport England have provided at this stage.
They've been really clear on their on the actual application website. So it is really simple. It's one of the clearest guidance notes and simplest Sport England application I certainly have seen. And I just urge everyone just to go through it. They've also actually provided the questions in advance for the online form, so you can actually have a go and see and like kind of prepare your answers before kind of going through the online process as well. So I would just urge everyone just to look through that criteria. It's the same with the Community Response Fund, any fund. Just read through that criteria. I know it's time consuming, but it's well worth doing.
Yeah. Another one that I think we can give a quick answer on. So how can cycling instructors who cannot deliver cycle training at present be redeployed in other work in the current situation? And I think there's, I mean, I can just say there's flexibility on that, I guess. It's having those conversations. Georgie, I don't know if you want to add on anything on that in terms of kind of rules around it or restrictions, but.
Whether you can be deployed elsewhere?
Redeployed, yeah.
Well, this all depends. How you, I mean, I think just reading the question, if you're furloughed, that's a slightly different.
Yeah, I think well, I'm reading it as they're not furloughed. So in that sense, you can be redeployed.
Yeah, if I say if it's a freelancer, and I don't know if this is redeployed by the company. I mean, that depends on the company that you work for, the companies that you work for. This is where, and you know, there's only so much help that the government can provide. This is where webinars like this is where community platforms, social media, LinkedIn, all of these things are so vitally important right now. You know, we can help you, but you can also help each other. You know, use this time if you are unable to do what you would normally do in, you know, looking elsewhere at what other options you might have available, in, you know, building up a website, checking out your LinkedIn, brushing up your CV, networking, going to webinars like this, getting ideas and thinking about how you can. I mean, that to me would be my instinctive answer to that. In terms of whether there's any official things you can do, I'm not really sure, but I do think that we can help each other on this.
Perfect, thank you. Chris, do you want to just give a bit of an update on the next event series?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try and share my screen again and see if this works, which it probably won't now, but let's see how I get on. So yeah, look, obviously, as kind of Kerry outlined at the start and sort of referenced throughout, this is the first in a sort of new series that we are collectively with the Mayor's Office and London Sport looking to put together to help address some of the kind of specific queries and questions that each of us as organisations has been receiving from partners as we kind of gone through the past few weeks. Undoubtedly, finance funding was one of the preeminent questions we were receiving. It's why we were so keen to make this the first thing that we focused on. But we have also received a lot of queries around actually what is practically available in terms of guidance and advice for organisations that are looking to continue what they do, but move it into a digital space and actually help to contribute to efforts to get people to remain active, but to do so within the sort of confines of their own home. So the next session that we run will be looking at exercising at home, and we're looking at how organizations can adapt their activities to take advantage of digital tools, how they can provide things that actually are really tailored towards the needs of people as they choose to get active in a different environment. And we'll also be digging into some of the particular considerations when it comes to being inclusive in that field and actually ensuring that efforts we make at this stage are really representative of the broad needs of people, so that we're not only catering to people that are already active, but we're supporting perhaps the people that most need guidance and advice around how to continue to be active at what is undoubtedly a really difficult time for everybody. So we'll publish the date of that certainly by early next week. We may even try and get it out by the end of this week, but the format will be similar. We'll be running it through a sign-up form. We will again be oversubscribed yet in order to account for any dropout that we receive on the day. So if that's a subject that is of interest to you, please watch out for the emails that will come from ourselves and from the Mayor's Office. Take a look at London Sport's website as well, and take a look at our social media. We'll be publicising that as soon as we're able to do so. And obviously, one of the other things that is just worth saying is, you know, we intend to keep this series going for as long as we need it to continue. We've got a number of ideas based on feedback that we have received so far, but if there are things that are really pressing and really urgent for people, drop us a line about them, get in touch. We haven't got a sort of set in stone 3-month program for this, so we're absolutely open to being influenced about what else we should be covering. And the best way we can do that is kind of being in a dialogue with all of you about what would be most valuable.
Perfect, thanks. I think we're a minute over, so I'm not a good timekeeper. But we have put, so if people wouldn't mind putting their feedback in the social link, and I'd just like to thank both our speakers, Georgie and Chris, and everyone for taking the time to come and listen to us for an hour. And if you do have any follow-up questions that we haven't been able to cover because of the time, please just follow up with either Mayor of London, London Sport, or directly with Georgie, and we should be able to help and provide some feedback to you personally. So thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.